Hello, lovely people. Hope you're doing okay today. I always wanted to do a video about a full TS parameters, and I was thinking about it. I was looking at them, and the thing is when I explain things, for some reason it takes a very long time. So to go through all the TS parameters, it would take me literally ages, and I might do that a bit later on, maybe like one parameter at a time. However, today I would like to tackle the most, because most of the parameters are kind of easy to understand and self-explanatory, but the one that I personally, me myself, had trouble understanding was the Q factor, the Q parameter. And today I would like to tackle this Q thingy. So this video is going to be about one TS parameter, QTS, and we're going to just touch QMS, QES. I have a few props ready here at the bottom. I have actually loads of stuff ready. And let's start with the basics. So just a heads up, this is going to be a little bit math heavy because there's no other way. There's no really simple way of explaining this without literally no math. So just bear with me. If you don't understand the math, that's fine. Keep listening because I will have some actual examples that don't include that, like a lot of math. So first of all, the Q. The Q itself, the definition of the Q uh, is this formula. So it basically means that you take any kind of peak. So let's go to like EQ, for example, this one, yeah? You can have a positive, like a boost in EQ or a cut in EQ. So it is the same, it's just different positive or negatives. So let's, for example, take the positive hump. And as we know, everybody uses EQ, and in EQ you have a few things to change. You can change the frequency, which just move this point. You can have the gain, which like plus minus 0, and you have the variable Q. So the Q itself, it's defined by the central frequency of the bandwidth and the difference between the 2 points of the bandwidth. So if I'm going to go a bit lower here, there's a picture. There we go. That's a picture. So you have like a hump, same like I have here in EQ. I have a central frequency, which is like 320 hertz. And then you have these minus 3 dB points. And if you take one frequency minus the other one, you have the difference in those frequencies. And basically you take the central frequency and divide it by that difference. And basically what that means is, where is it? The higher the Q, let's take for example 10, the higher the Q, the narrower is this peak or dip. Yeah, so for dip you can easily see. So if it's 10, it's very narrow. If it's, for example, 1, it's very wide. So just in general, this is like a definition of Q. Now let's go to till small parameters. So small signal parameters, TS small, I'm going to try to do a video of all of them. And we're going to take this QTS. So QTS is a parameter that you have, any driver will, any manufacturer will supply this parameter. So you have QMS, QES, and QTS. So QMS is the like mechanical Q factor, which is like for this parameter is the suspension. It's mainly the suspension that is responsible for that. QES is the motor structure, so that's electrical. And QTS is a factor of both. So if, again, we go back here, so this is how it's defined. You have QMS times QES and divided by QMS plus QES. So QMS is always going to be a bigger number, and QES is always going to be a smaller number. And if you would just like imagine that, like if you take a big number times small number is going to be a small number. If you take a big number plus small number, is going to be a big number. So, and in general, like if you divide small number by big number, you're going to have a small number. I know it might not make sense, but it's just for easier to understand. But the main thing what I'm trying to say is QTS is almost, I want to say always going to be closer to QES. So that means that QTS is defined by QES much more than QMS. That means that the motor structure has much bigger influence on the whole QTS parameter than the suspension. So even if we have a look at like some drivers, so I have like QMS, QS, and QTS. And you can see QMS is always like 5, 11, 8, 4. It's a big number. And QS is always small number, like below 1. And the QTS is always going to be very close to QES. See? 0.8, 0.7, 15, 14, 4, 4. So basically this, it has some influence on the QTS, but not as much. So it's kind of defined by QES. So now, since we kind of, in my opinion, derived that QTS is kind of defined by QES, the electrical Q. What is the electrical Q? So if we know that Q in like EQ is defined by how this shape looks like, yeah? If I'm gonna go positive, this. Have you ever seen this shape anywhere in TS parameters? You've probably seen it if you had a look at impedance graph. So impedance graph has the same shape as this EQ band. It has a peak. And if we can have like this Q parameter, like if I'm gonna put 0.5, it's very wide. If we can define this peak with a Q factor, we can do exactly the same for the impedance graph. And if I open, is it this one? This one. So these are just a few of impedance sweeps that I took of some of the drivers that I have. And let's have a look at a few of them. So let's compare this one, for example, and this one. So the red one is a full range driver that I have in my bookshelf speaker, and this is the impedance curve that that driver has in the box. And as you can see, this peak is narrow. So narrow peak means that the Q is going to be high. Remember, exactly the same. Low Q, wide. A high Q, narrow. And it's exactly the same. If you compare these two drivers, you can assume that this red one has a higher Q than the green one, QES, because QES is defined exactly the same way. You take the central frequency, for example, in this driver is going to be 76, and you divide it by minus 3 dB points, which this one minus this one and this one. So this is going to be high Q driver, and this is going to be a low Q driver, and it's exactly the case. So this, it's a Russian Soviet driver that I have, and this driver has a Q of 0.7, even higher, probably 0.8, so a high Q driver. And this is just a driver that I had, it's an 8-inch, like a mid-bass driver, and this Q is something like 0.3, 0.35, and you can see this driver has a much wider impedance peak. So this is like in general how you can see the differences between the Qs. Now, Q changes if you put a driver in a box. So the Q changes and the central frequency changes. So this, for example, is my Alpine Type X. It has an impedance graph like this, impedance peak. It has a Q of, if I remember, where is it? Alpine Type X, QTS, 0.6 QES. Yeah, so it's kind of peaky. Yeah, if I put this driver in a box, so in a smaller box, the frequency goes up and the Q becomes higher. And if it's in a bigger box, frequency is a bit lower and the Q is a bit lower as well. So even if these look kind of similar, the Q is going to be different because it's on a log scale. Because if you put it, oh, no, you're not going to see. If you put it like, the difference between this is much smaller than the difference between this because it's on a log scale. Okay, so QES is derived from the impedance graph that we can take with date and dats, or in my case, I just have a kind of a jig, yeah? So this is QES. And now we know that QES defines the total Q, QTS, because it's very similar, yeah? Oh, shoot. I just messed it up. There we go. So next what I did, to better understand this Q and what it is and how it looks like, let's go back to Helix, and we're gonna be jumping back and forth between programs because it's easier to show visually. So if I take a Q or very low, let's say 0.5 Q, yeah, I have very wide cut. Now imagine if I would have like this frequency 315, if I just cut a line and like, I want to see like this, I wouldn't show you. I'm going to show you only half of it. What does it look like, this curve? This looks like a crossover. And if I would add a crossover like this, so let's say like this, see? It looks very similar to a crossover, yeah? And these crossovers have different topologies. So I have Butterworth, I have Bessel, Chebyshev, and Linkwitz. And as you can see, the shape of those crossovers are slightly different. So what defines this shape? A helix has a crossover, which is like Butterworth, Bessel, Chebyshev, Linkwitz, and self-defined. So self-defined crossover, you can define the Q of the crossover yourself. So it goes from 0.5, 0.6789, and it goes up. See? You can define the Q. And if I overlay this one that I have with the crossover, you can see the shape is very, very similar. So this crossover that I have, where is it? Is it this one? So this EQ band that I have is Q of 0.5. And this crossover that I have, self-defined, has a Q of 0.5. And it doesn't follow here because this kind of adds up, but if you imagine, if you just remove all of this part and it wouldn't add anything, it would follow this perfectly. So basically the crossovers are defined by Q, and specific Q values for the crossovers have names. So if I open this one, see? So these are different crossovers, Linkwitz, Riley, Bessel, Butterworth, and they have different predefined Q values. So Linkwitz, Riley is 0.49. So let's actually check this. 0.49 is very close to 0.5. If I open this, now let's remove the EQ band and let's this crossover. So this crossover is self-defined 0.5. And on this one, let me highlight it. Linkwitz Riley, 12 dB, is exactly the same as 0.5 because the Q of Linkwitz Riley is 0.49. They overlay. So now you cannot see the difference because it's the same. If I would change the frequency a bit so you could see, they just overlaying, fit perfectly on each other. Yeah, you can see that. So this was a kind of discovery for me that 1,000 these crossover topologies have different Qs. So let's check the other one. Bezel is 0.58, so it's very close to 0.6. Let me enter 0.6. So this is self-defined 0.6, and it has a bit of a bump. And if I go here, where's the Butterworth? Bezel. Bezel. 0.6 is just the frequency. For some reason it doesn't match, but see, it matches perfectly. 0.6 bezel, 12 dB. And last one, Butterworth, 0.7. So let's do 0.7. And on this one, Butterworth. Let's just play with the frequency. And you can see they match perfectly. So same Q that defines the EQ band, it's used for the slope of the crossover. And as I mentioned, predefined, though these are like the scientists, whatever, who came up with these, they have like predefined values of Q. So what this has to do with driver Q that is derived from QES. So QES and QTS are very close. Let's go to this one. If I have a driver, so I chose these 6 drivers with different QTS, 0.4, 0.7, 1.4, 0.7, 114, 5.6. So I chose these drivers and I am modeling their response in infinite baffle, so in free air. Because if you put a driver in a box, like this one in WinISD, so this, sealed. So this driver, Alpine Type X, is this one. It has a Q of QTS 0.56. If I put it in a box, like 2 cubic feet, the QTC of the box is higher. So basically, if you put like some air behind the driver, the Q of the system itself increases. So the box changes the Q of the driver. And if I don't want any kind of box influence, just to check the response, I put it in infinite baffle. So if I have these drivers in infinite baffle, these are responses that I have of those specific, and you can see they're different. So like, for example, this one, a high Q driver, has a different response from this one, which has very low Q driver. Yeah. And what I did with these drivers, I exported these frequency responses with this button, and I imported them into REW to check. So these are different drivers in IB. Let's clear it. So this is FI that I have. This is the response that it would have in infinite baffle application. This is modeling, yeah? And compare it to, for example, Alpine and stereo integrity, yeah, and Fatal Pro. It's and I put like the driver QTS. So this is like FI has 0.76 QTS. Alpine is a bit smaller. Stereo integrity even more smaller, 4.2. And I chose a few of these just to have something different. So this driver, Visaton, I have no idea what the driver is, but it has a very high Q. So I just want to see how it looks like. And this 18 sound have a very small Q of 0.14. And do you notice anything similar, like between this, and this? Does it look anything similar to this? It does, doesn't it? So what I did next, I chose, for example, this FI driver. I go to EQ window, And what I did is I chose a target, speaker driver, target. I chose the uh, filter type and the frequency. So this is Butterworth 12 dB. So if we go back to the Q, 0.7 is the Q of Butterworth filter in this one. So Butterworth 12 dB is 0.7 Q, exactly the same like this, 0.7 Q. Yeah, and this driver has a Q of 0.76 in free air. And that means that this driver in free air, its response, the bottom end of the response matches Butterworth 12 dB crossover. So it basically means that the electrical Q of the driver, how should I put it? Electrical Q of the driver acts as a crossover, like an like a mechanical electrical crossover that you don't have to apply into the DSP, but the driver itself has it. And it's 26 hertz. If I change the frequency, is different. So 26 hertz for this FI driver, where is it? FI, 26 is FS. So if you take a driver, if you model a driver in infinite baffle, the FS and the QTS defines the kind of natural crossover that that driver has with nothing applied. See? And if I take another one, for example, Alpine. So Alpine has a Q of 0.56. If we have a look at this, 0.56 is very close to bezel, 0.58. So in theory, Alpine should match bezel crossover. Let's have a look. Alpine EQ, bezel. So if I change this to 3, it changes. Bezel 12 dB, a slightly different frequency, 35 hertz, but it matches perfectly. Now let's have another one. Stereo integrity. It's a smaller Q of 0.42. 0.42 is close to Linkwitz-Riley, 0.49. Let's double check. 0.42 EQ, Linkwitz-Riley 2, it matches almost perfect. Not perfect, but almost perfect. Because if I change it to Butterworth, it's totally different. If I change to bezel, again, it's totally different. So the closest it matches Linkwitz-Riley. So this was like a discovery for me that the driver Q, QTS, is like a crossover. And that's why you can play a high Q driver, such as like FI, with no crossovers applied, and they will still this excursion. Let's just add some power. So high Q driver manages the excursion. It doesn't over excursion because the driver itself acts as a crossover. That's why it cuts this. If you have a very low Q driver, such as like this, 18 sound, you can see the excursion goes through the roof because this one acts as, let's double check how it acts, is this one. 18 sound, EQ. So I did match it just for you to see it's the same. So it matches Butterworth 1, which is a 6 dB slope. So 0.14 Q of the driver matches 6 dB slope. And if you can imagine, like if you put a 6 dB slope, 6 dB crossover on a driver, it doesn't really protect it unless the crossover frequency is very high. So that's why this one is going over excursion. This one needs some kind of support to manage the excursion. So low Q drivers need help managing the excursion. High Q drivers don't need it because the driver itself acts, as I mentioned, as a crossover. So how can you support this driver for not over excurge? So there's a few options. You can put a subsonic filter on it, then it just cuts this, so in free air, or you can have a box, because as I mentioned in an enclosure, this one, the Q changes for sealed and for ported as well, but in a slightly different way. Where is my this one? So this is a peerless driver in a sealed box. It has like one peak. This is a sealed box, and it has one peak at the FC of the box, a combination of resonant frequency of the driver itself and the box. And if you have it in a ported box, there's a dip in the impedance graph. And basically what happens is that the port loads the cone and it doesn't let the cone move a lot at that frequency. And that is why low Q drivers like this 18 sound needs a ported box, because it wouldn't work in sealed. The sealed box wouldn't manage the Q so much, so it would manage the excursion. That's why it needs a port. So I don't know if anything that I'm saying kind of makes sense to you, but the discovery for me was that uh, the Q of the driver is basically a high pass filter, a natural high pass filter that is on the driver itself. And that's how you can look at the driver Q. And another thing that I want to show you is, for example, these two drivers have the same Q, so almost the same, 0.76 and 0.7. So the same Q. The only difference between these is the FS, the resonance frequency. So if I go here, the FI has an FS of 26 and Fatal Pro has an FS of 55. The Q is almost the same, the QTS. The biggest difference is the FS. And you can see that, where is it? Here, the difference is where it starts to roll off. So the FS kind of defines where the driver is rolling off. So if I have this Fatal Pro EQ, so again, it matches, it's just overlaid so you cannot see, 75. And this matches Butterworth at 55 Hertz. And the FI matches Butterworth at 26 Hertz, but is the same topology, same 12 dB filter, is just at a different frequency. So this is how like FS affects, but the response, the roll off is exactly the same. So this for me was a very interesting thing, that you can tie like the mathematical Q, which is, where is it? This one, Q factor. The mathematical Q, you can tie it to EQ. From EQ, I noticed that is the same as the crossovers, and they do have predefined Q values. And drivers themselves that have a Q defined from the frequency response, the QES, which is very similar to QTS, they have a natural roll-off exactly the same as those crossovers. And again, just to repeat myself, a high Q driver acts as a driver that has a steeper slope, like 12 dB slope, different topology. And basically, the lower the Q, the shallower the slope, the higher the Q, the higher the slope. And it's the same like Chebyshev 1. I don't have, I couldn't find the driver of Q of 1, but I found this one, which is like this. And if you check with EQ, so it acts kind of a Butterworth, but Butterworth goes down. And there's no crossover that, there's no predefined crossover that has such high Q. But, so this is 1.4. If I go to this one and I go to predefined, with this I can 1.4. So see Q 1.4. So it would act as this crossover, but it doesn't have a name. So Butterworth, these, as you see, it goes up to 1. Chebyshev is 1. And there's no predefined crossover at Q of 1.4. But in theory, you can have it. So if I would export this red curve into REW, it would be, I guarantee it would be exactly the same as this curve. So for me, this was kind of a discovery that all drivers, QES, QTS, is the same as a high-pass filter. Yeah. It's a lengthy video. I don't know if it's going to be interesting for you, but for me, it was kind of a click in my mind, because like to understand what is Q is different, especially if you look just at like TS, like this sheet, and it's just a number. So now I can see that this QTS 0.3, for example, for this particular driver, is kind of smallish, and I can imagine it would act as lower than Linkwitz-Riley. So Linkwitz-Riley is already a shallow slope, but this would be even shallower than that. And then I know that this driver ideally would need a ported box to support the excursion, because otherwise it would just bottom out. And high Q drivers, for example, I think this one is a bit higher. Let's have a look at this. So this QTS of 0.46, this is a Dayton high excursion, and 0.46, it's close to Linkwitz-Riley. So I know that this driver could work in IB or sealed, because it would kind of manage its excursion. Again, if we go back to here, 0.46, so something similar like this, 0.42. And the excursion is kind of managed. It doesn't go like out of control like this, but it goes like this. So for me, it was just fun to see how can I tie up this QTS with something that you can actually see on the graph and how the driver actually performs. Yeah, so I think I'm going to cut it here. Just wanted to share this discovery of mine, how I tied up. If I made any mistakes in my assumptions, please feel free to comment and correct me, because all of this I just derived from my own head. It might be not correct, it might be just a coincidence that everything is matching like this, but I think it's not a coincidence. I think it is like this. Yeah. So cool. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.